Welcome everybody, I'm Andrew Palmer and this is the first video in the first series of our new reading group. Across 4 monthly meetings we're going to discuss 4 books, all of them written in a short period between 1958 and 1966. This series is called Literature and Power because all of our books challenge mainstream ways of thinking, whether it's about ideas of class, sexuality, gender or imperialism. That is to say, they employ a kind of literary power that talks back to political power. Each in their own distinctive way, our 4 books lock antlers with the establishment, none more so than our first book, Alan Sillitoe's classic 1958 novel, Saturday Night and Sunday Morning. The first thing to say is that this was a very culturally prominent book in the late 1950s. It was published as a paperback and it sold over 1 million copies, which was an extraordinary number of books in those days. It was turned into a very successful movie in 1960 starring Albert Finney. There's the poster. Sillitoe was one of the so-called angry young men of the 1950s, a group of largely working class writers who represented a major post-war shift in literary culture. And here's a picture from the movie of Albert Finney as Arthur Seaton standing at his lathe, and maybe in the session we can talk a bit more about lathes. I don't know how many of you have ever stood at a lathe. I did it once when I was at school. If we need details on what that's like, we can discuss. Let me turn though to the start of the novel. It opens with an extraordinary image of the central character, Arthur Seaton, tumbling dead drunk down the stairs in a Nottingham pub called the White Horse. We get a strong sense of a working class community blowing off steam at the end of the working week. And there's some great language here. Here's a key paragraph. For it was Saturday night, the best and bingiest glad time of the week, one of the 52 holidays in the slow-turning big wheel of the year, a violent preamble to a prostrate Sabbath. Piled up passions were exploded on Saturday night, and the effect of a week's monotonous graft in the factory was swilled out of your system in a burst of goodwill. This is great stuff. So we have this sense of riot, of carnival, and in the midst of it all, there's Arthur, loaded up with booze. After his tumble, he gets himself to his feet and, what else, orders himself another drink. And as he's making his way back through the pub, he feels, quote, strangely taken up by a fierce power that he could not control, at which point he vomits over a respectable middle-aged chap, and that chap responds like this. He says, "My God," the man cried, "look at this, look at what the young bogger's gone and done. Would you believe it? My best suit, only pressed and cleaned today. Who would credit such a thing? Oh dear, it cost me 15 bob, as if money grows on trees, and suits as well. I wonder how I'll ever get the stains out. Oh dear." Right, I think this is quite funny. It operates on a comic level rather than on a realistic, deeply smelly and unpleasant level. But we are perhaps left with slightly mixed feelings. On the one hand, we're sort of thrilled with Arthur's youthful shenanigans and sort of free spirit. And on the other hand, we certainly wouldn't want to be the chap upon whom he vomits. The booze he drinks is described as high-octane fuel. So we've got this idea that his subversive revelry, his power as an incorrigible rogue, is fueled by this booze, and that it explodes out of him in the form of vomit, in a sort of hurrah moment. But as I say, on the other hand, we might have mixed feelings about it. That's something we might discuss. The chapter ends with Arthur in bed with Brenda, who's the wife of his mate Jack. And the novel goes on to develop a running contrast between Arthur and Jack. So Arthur is this larger-than-life mischievous spirit. Jack, on the other hand, is responsible and diligent, but a bit boring. He wasn't at the pub that night because he stayed at home to do his accounts, and he's not there when Arthur goes to bed with his wife because he's working nights. And why is he working nights? Because he's saving up money to buy a television, which was the must-have mod con of the late 1950s. So in the first few pages of the novel, Sillitoe sets up these oppositions, Arthur's mischief versus Jack's obedience. And for me, I find myself torn between the two. And again, that's something we might discuss. Where do you feel the balance lies in that opposition between Arthur and Jack? Of course, Sillitoe isn't the first person to represent working class life in fiction, but all of those 19th century novels about working class lives by the likes of Elizabeth Gaskell or Charles Dickens tend to have a campaigning motive. They tend to be about improving factory conditions or mitigating the downside of industrial capitalism. Another kind of novel represents working class life as something to be escaped. I'm thinking perhaps of D.H. Lawrence's Sons and Lovers from 1913. It's a novel about getting away, but the assumption for Lawrence is that all workers would wish to escape, or indeed should wish to escape from that culture. Saturday Night and Sunday Morning doesn't operate like that at all. It represents the lives of those, the vast majority, who have no route out of working class life and for the most part no evident wish to escape the culture into which they were born. So this is a novel that doesn't have that familiar narrative arc of tragedy or escape, those familiar working class stories from earlier novels. It simply represents those lives and poses this question. Is Arthur able to rebel and create some freedom for himself, or is he caught, trapped by the structures of work, family, matrimony and citizenship into which he finds himself born? Is he the rebel he likes to think he is, or is he in fact merely complying with a system which permits him the weekends to blow off steam? So this novel asks a new and a different kind of question about working class life. And all of this is brought to a head, a glorious head, in chapter 11 of the novel, in a wonderful key scene at the Goose Fair. And I'll just say a quick word about that to close off. The Goose Fair is an ancient annual festivity in Nottingham which began as a livestock fair and evolved into a fun fair. And here is a painting of the fair from 1926 by one Arthur Spooner, which really captures the feel of the event. Notice the helter-skelter at the back of the picture to the left behind those balloons. The helter-skelter plays an important and rather symbolic role in the chapter in the novel, so watch out for that. There's a key moment when Arthur's standing at the top of it, about to plummet down. Notice also in the picture the police constable standing on the boundary of the fair, just to the left of the curb there, as if the fair exists within a boundary in which revelry is permitted, but then just on the edges of that boundary the forces of law and order are there just to see that the riotous behaviour stays confined. The Goose Fair is like Saturday Night at the White Horse writ large, and this is how Sillitoe describes it. Sanity was out of reach. They were caught up in balloons of light and pleasure that would not let them go. The 4-acre fair became a whole world with tents and caravans, stalls and roundabouts, booths and towers, swing boats and engines and big wheels, and a crowd that had lost all idea of time and place, locked in the belly of its infernal noise. Wonderful stuff. Arthur is in his element in this madcap environment, and he causes as much mischief as possible. He seems to become the trickster king of the fair, but the forces of respectability are closing in on him. He finally gets caught out, beaten up, and the whole tone of the novel changes in the second part of the book, which is subtitled Sunday Morning, as in the morning after. And in that part of the book, he gets a steady girlfriend, Doreen, and he seems to be moving inexorably towards matrimony and conformity. And yet, at the end of the book, he's still defiant. So what do we make of his thoughts represented in that wonderful final chapter of the novel? Is it bravado, or is there still something to celebrate in his defiance? That's something to discuss. Okay, that brings me to the end of my opening remarks. I've sent you an email with some discussion points, things to look out for. I've also suggested some key passages which we might home in on as a way of structuring our conversation. That said, if you find any paragraphs or short sections of the novel that strike you as particularly interesting, please make a note and we'll try and throw those into the mix as well. So enjoy reading the novel, and I'll see you at our first meeting very soon. Cheers.